So hello everyone, really pleased to see everybody here. I can see we've got several faces, several names on there that have been to our last few webinars, so a very big welcome to everybody, whether this is your first one or your next one. My name is Savinda. I'm the content manager for First Practice Management. No doubt you'll have heard of us if you've subscribed to any of our services or attended any of our Thornfield's training courses in the past. So this month's webinar, we'll be looking at avoiding fraud in general practice. This will probably last between 20 and 30 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session as well. So if you have any questions, then feel free to add them to the chat box on the screen. We'll mute mics for these sessions while Phil's carrying on. But if you have any questions, then please add them to the chat section afterwards. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to our presenter, Phil Harnby.
Thanks, Vinda. Much appreciated. Hopefully everyone can see the slides on the screens. And today's presentation is kind of off the back of last month's presentation, which was looking at kind of conflicts. So we thought it might be wise to kind of add a bit more depth to some of the things that came out of that presentation. So if you're kind of new to this list of presentations, it might be worth also having a look back at that one as well as the others that we've done. So this, I think, is now the fifth. So hopefully everyone's got their tea or a coffee, and we'll, as I said, Serena said, we'll do about 28 minutes to half an hour, along with kind of Q&As, and if there are any as we go along, just drop them into the chat box. So, quick disclaimer, this is not professional advice. I'm not being paid to give you advice on this, so it's all nonsense. If you want to pay me later, then it's all good stuff, but for the present time, it's not. So my name is Phil Harnby, as Savinda kindly introduced me there. I'm a chartered accountant, have been for a number of years, and I work for a firm, or own a firm to be more precise, called Mitchells Greaveson. We're based up in County Durham in the northeast. We've been around since 1973. And we've looked after doctors, and I personally have looked after doctors and GP practices for more years than I care to remember. So the key to fraud is to avoid it at all possible costs, and appreciate that it's significantly easier to say than the reality of the situation. And we're going to kind of talk about a plethora of levels of fraud, from very, very big down to very, very small, but it's all under the same context. It's all illegal. Any kind of fraud is not good, and there is potential criminal penalties that sit behind that. I thought it'd be worth starting with kind of what we've seen in the recent past. So these are just a few articles. They're all available freely via Google. It's quite interesting if you can lose a couple of hours just Googling GP practice and fraud. And as I mentioned before, some of them, not necessarily significant sums of money in the grand scheme of things. £46,000 isn't quite retire to Hawaii or further afield type money. But there is at the bottom of the screen there, six figures, and one practice in York, 700,000, and they're just the ones that you can Google. So this is something that is happening consistently within all businesses, not just necessarily GP practices, but something that I think we need to be acutely aware of. And also, we might need to be acutely aware of the people that are in here, that it's to avoid fraud, not to figure out how to get beyond it. But the systems and processes that we put in place will hopefully prevent anything from happening, kind of moving forward. And I think the thing we've also got to think about as well is it's not just people with their hands in the till, is the practice itself defrauding another organisation. So the NHS did a survey a couple of years ago, and they reckon 88 million is taken out of the health service each year through bad claiming. Now, whether that's deliberately bad claims, or it is just errors and omissions that are happening, but it's a huge chunk of money which is being taken out of the NHS. So it's been good within the practice generally, also has knock-on effects beyond that. And just to reassure you, I'm not just doing some GP practice bashing. Accountants are just as guilty, and there is in fact one accountant who has taken £60,000 out of GP practices over the course of the pandemic. And again, we'll talk about kind of ways and means of stopping that kind of external fraud from happening to you as individuals and as practices. So how to avoid it? So over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about some kind of top tips as to what we can do to try and avoid or mitigate fraud. And I think the thing that I've always been told throughout my entire career as an accountant is we are all capable of committing fraud, myself included. I haven't, just to reassure people, but I think there's the capability of all of us, and it comes down to two things: a need and an opportunity. So if I needed £1 million and an opportunity came up in front of me to get that £1 million, well, how big is that need? And different levels affect different people, but certainly in my own career, I've seen a number of individuals that have seen jail time because of getting into financial difficulties, problems at home, drug or alcohol type of abuse, and they get the opportunity to take £500, £1,000, and that just becomes too tempting. So I think we've got to be careful of our own positions as well as kind of the people that are around us. So we always want to have, and what we often call in our industry is segregation of duties. So the person that's saying, yeah, those invoices are absolutely fine, isn't also the same person that's making the payment. So we're not ending up with pieces of paper that end up on people's desks that aren't necessarily correct and appropriate to then make a payment for. And the reason that we talk about the segregation of duties is that unless there's two people collaborating, and that's very uncommon, but unless those two people are collaborating, it's difficult for money to be stolen. So as an example, you get an invoice in from a locum. If you're the one saying, yeah, that's definitely okay to be paid, and you're also the one making the payment, well, it's very easy for you to slip an invoice in there that maybe didn't come from a locum that is legitimate. So having a separate person, and of course what generally tends to happen in practices is that it's all levied at the door of the practice manager, where in reality it's the partners in the practice. The practice manager may be one of those partners, but the partners as a whole are responsible for their money. So it's okay giving all the duties to the practice manager, but actually the response, the resolution of any problems really needs to be sat with a partner. And I was talking to a practice manager a few months ago about this type of scenario, about, well, who agrees the invoice should be paid, who makes the payment. And she said, oh yeah, I remember years ago when I started here 40 years ago that the practice manager took all the invoices down to the partner on a Friday, and the partner would sit with a checkbook and sit and write all the checks out while looking at the invoices. And that sounds very archaic, but actually in reality that is probably what should be happening in every practice, that no payment should be made without a senior person approving that process and ensuring that it's happening properly. And I mentioned that should always be reviewed. You don't just upload all of those, and you're moving on from the good old-fashioned checkbook, although they do still exist, but moving away from that checkbook to kind of online payments, making sure that we've not, we don't just put on all those payments, then someone just goes in and press send, that's okay, we can make those. Actually going in and checking, well, does that invoice tie in, do the bank details on the invoice tie into the payment that's been made? Because it's very difficult to recover monies that are sent by a bank transfer if they're done incorrectly, and that could be by mistake. We've put a 1 instead of a 2, or could be done maliciously. We've put our own bank details in as opposed to a supplier. And from chatting to kind of banking colleagues in the past, unless you catch it within about an hour to 2 hours, you very much struggle to recover that money back, unless the person that you've sent it to is honest enough to send it back. And we've all seen those hit stories in the papers where 100 grand is dropped into such and such's account. they're not necessarily going to hold their hands up and turn around, and it goes back to that opportunity again with regards to people's attitudes towards things. So yeah, make sure that those invoices are reviewed by the person that is then making the payment, so that again separate to that person that's approving that the invoice should be paid, so that we've got that segregation of duties, that flow through of information between the different parties. And again, we shouldn't be levying one person's sole responsibility around something. And I'll come back to petty cash in a moment, but it shouldn't be just one person that has complete control over a bank account. And there should be, a level of authorization to actually, up to, and I put an example there on the screen of kind of up to £500. One person can make that decision, the practice manager, the deputy, one partner by themselves. And again, it depends on the size of your practice. If your practice has got a £5 million turnover, £500 might not be sufficient. It may need to be higher than that. But for a lot of practices, that's it would be unusual to be spending £500 without it already being agreed, as a one-off type item. So an individual might be able to do that, but between 500, maybe £1,000 and above that, two people should make that decision. And even potentially at a high level above that, so actually if we're going to spend more than £10,000, all the partners need to agree. And we have that in our own business. If I want to go and buy a replacement pen, I don't need to go and speak to my business partner about it. But if I'm going to go and buy a new laptop, I would go and have that conversation about, look, we need to spend a couple of grand on a laptop. Are you happy for that to happen? And 9 times out of 10, if it's the other way around or that way around, then yeah, everyone's happy, and I'm sure that's the same in your own practices. But again, it's just that not one person having responsibility for doing something without the okay of others, and that gives that person making those decisions reassurance as well. Well, I have checked. I have made sure that that's okay. I'm not just buying myself a new laptop because I fancy a new laptop, or it's my daughter's birthday coming up and I'll keep the old laptop and I'm going to give her a new one. It just removes that any possibility of concern or worry, really. I suppose actually, if I go back to that, so I mentioned petty cash. Sometimes with petty cash, again, you want to make sure the limits are relatively low. You might actually just want one person responsible for it, because then there's just one person you've got to go back and challenge. So if you're petty cashed in, and again, most GP practices don't have oceans of petty cash, there might be a couple of £100 in there at any one time to buy some tea, milk or sugar, or pay the window cleaner or something along those kinds of lines. But if just one person has access, if that tin's wrong, then it can only really be that one person that could be to blame for that, or could be asked about it. And again, if the limits in that tin are felt relatively small, then it's not the end of the world if the tin was stolen or it is incorrect by an amount. Or if the petty cash tin is just sat under reception's desk for when the window cleaner pops in to pay or when the milkman needs paying, or when someone needs to run out and grab some tea bags. If the tin's just under there, it's very easy for anybody to just go and borrow £20 with the full intention of paying it back, and 3 weeks later still haven't, and they've forgotten that they borrowed that £20. So sometimes there is instances where you might want some tighter controls that prevent or can narrow down where the problem can be. But at the same time, having that position that we've got on the screen there, where actually, if it's significant sums of money, we don't necessarily want one individual potentially being blamed, having the responsibility for. So I've again picked a random picture off Google of some GP practice staff. So I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with any of these people. I'm sure they're all absolutely honest and trustworthy individuals. But when it comes to the salaries, if you look at kind of what's going out of your bank accounts every month, the salary bill will be the largest, potentially next by partner drawings, if it's not all part of the same payment. So making sure that there's somebody in the practice, generally a partner, is responsible for paying those staff. So have the right pay levels gone through? Does the pay tie into what we're expecting it to be? All of a sudden, is somebody seeing a £2,000 bonus that nobody's authorised? If we're doing if we're just doing peer reviews, we're doing peer rise and things like that, has the appropriate levels being attributed to that? And I have seen in a practice an individual that gave themselves a 10% pay rise every year. The kind of across the board was a relatively moderate, 1-2% kind of keep in line with inflation, but every year without fail, she gave herself a 10% pay rise, and on a retirement day admitted it. I thought bizarre in itself, but yeah, every year and she'd worked there for 20 years. So you add that up over time, all of a sudden it's a very large sum of money that had been taken without agreement. And again, the partners are responsible to ensure that those things happen correctly. So when payroll is being done, yeah, absolutely, it might be the practice manager, it might be their deputy that is preparing the payroll, could be an external body that is making that. But again, when that payment's being put through the bank, when those transactions are happening, somebody else is checking. You say, well, actually, do these people exist? Of our 20 people or so that we've got on the screen there, is there 21 people on the payroll, or is there just 20? Do we recognise their names? Do we, does their pay look reasonable to the job that we think that they're doing? And in a smaller practice, that's much easier because you know everybody. Where if you've got 50 people on the payroll, it's quite easy. I used to work for a firm that employed kind of 100 staff. Every so often you would see somebody you'd never seen before. That isn't necessarily unlikely. So if you've got a large payroll, that double check that are those people there. Is that pay in line with what I think they're doing? So if we've got a healthcare earning £50,000 a year, is that right or wrong? And making sure that everything's right, because 9 times out of 10 it could be just a mistake. And I'm sure employment contracts have written in that if we paid that healthcare £50,000 rather than their proper salary, we can recover that back. But if they've spent it the next day on a new car, it's very difficult to recover that money back when they don't necessarily have it, and they'd have to work a long time to pay that money back. So it's not just necessarily preventing people from doing things and taking money that they shouldn't be doing, but at the same time, it stops mistakes from happening and ensures that the information is correct in the first instance. The biggest area that we tend to see practice fraud happen within is locum payments, and they're because they're irregular, they're one-off, they're to random people or to random doctors, and it's therefore easier for problems to occur within this area. So we tend to see time and time again that this and I had a practice that lost about £120,000. It was actually recovered. So the Gambling Commission actually insisted on it being paid back by the gambling body that this person was gambling with. But again, it was just over the course of 6 or 7 months, lots and lots of locum invoices that didn't really exist. So having those processes in place to make sure, and I've mentioned it there, that reviewing locum payments and investigating any other unknown names. So I don't recognise Dr. Prodit. Why do we have that? Why are they there? And again, some records behind that of, well, why did we have a locum that day? So we've got the invoice from Dr. Prodit. Why was that individual in the practice? Who were they covering? Were they covering somebody who was off, somebody who was on holiday? So we've got that backup that if it was to be questioned at a later date, well, hey, there's the invoice. That's the date that we're covering. That's the other practitioner that person was covering for. So you've again got some reassurance that those things are happening in an appropriate way, and we're not seeing funds disappear that shouldn't necessarily be disappearing. And it's also, it's important as well that when we're doing our budgeting, our forecasting at the beginning of the year, we're not expecting any fraud. Yeah, so our budget should reflect what we think is going to happen. So by actually using those budgets and those forecasts and comparing them to the actuals, oddities should drop out. And I've put a screenshot there of the presentation we did right at the very beginning of this series around financial forecasting, that actually, if we've done that financial forecasting, that budgeting type of exercise, and we think we're going to spend £100,000 on locums, to pluck a number out of the air, and we spent 120, well, as part of that budgeting, forecasting, reviewing process, we should look at why have we spent £20,000 more? What's going on there that we weren't aware of? And hopefully it's not fraud, it's because actually we've got someone on the sick, or we've got a maternity leave that we weren't expecting, or something along those kinds of lines. But if there is something dodgy going on, it would enable us to highlight that much sooner. And the quicker we can highlight these problems, the quicker they can be dealt with. Because if you do have, a inverted commas dodgy person on the payroll, then if you don't look at stuff for 12 months, you definitely aren't going to catch them for 12 months. But if you're looking at every quarter or every month, you're much more likely to see those things drop out of the woodwork. And as well, from when we're looking at when that slide that we had with regards to the NHS and potentially defrauding of the NHS, again, have we done the right drugs claims? If all of a sudden every month we're normally claiming kind of £5,000 and all of a sudden it's £25,000, have we made an omission or an error somewhere in submitting that information? And the last thing we want is the NHS coming back was saying, we think you might have committed some fraud, we want to crawl over your records, please. Much better to head that off and go, we're really sorry, we put the wrong figure in, it should have been 5, we put 25 in, can we look to rectify that, please? And I think it would go without saying that using a specialist accountant is also a sensible thing to do, because we understand the things that are going on within practices. So if there is something going on that is a bit unusual, we are more likely to spot it than your average accountant looking at a GP practice. And I think by having that knowledge and understanding of the types of income we'd expect to see, the types of expenses, the trends and patterns that we'd expect to see across the course of the year would enable us more readily to highlight if there's any cause for concern. The massive caveat that every accountant will tell you is that it's impossible 9 times out of 10 for accountants to catch the fraud, and you can't, as practices, rely entirely on, oh, don't worry, the accountant's going to look at that at the end of the year. So if you look at the number of transactions that go through your bank accounts, we don't look at all of them all of the time, and unless we stumbled across the right transaction that happened at the wrong time, then it's very difficult for accountants to do that. And you see it time and time again in kind of big audit processes where things like Carillion, things like Northern Rock just weren't spotted by the external auditors, because, well, we're just looking at a part, we're not looking at everything all of the time, which is why those controls that we've talked about kind of at the beginning of this are really important to ensure that these things don't happen in the first instance, rather than the accountant that could only ever catch it once it's gone. So if you have had £100,000 disappear out of the practice bank account, it's all well and good the account going, oh, I think you've had £100,000 taken out of the account, but it would be much better to stop it before it went in the first instance. Because, as I said before, it is very difficult to then recover monies, and a lot of time and effort and grief. And the client that I mentioned before that had those sums taken, the individual actually ended up going to prison, which is on public record. But the police weren't that interested, and that did surprise me with 120,000. It took a bit of persuading from the practice to encourage the police to look at that. As I said, it's impossible to remove all risk. Absolutely, you can't. Life is full of risks, but putting in those internal controls, putting in things that enable us to spot it before it happens or prevent it, because actually if we know that it's just Margaret on reception who's looking after the petty cash tin, and Margaret knows it's just her, well, she's going to be really careful because she doesn't want the finger pointing at her, and it's difficult for other people because they know that Margaret's got it locked away and you can't just put your hand in. So putting those simple controls in place, then kind of getting the bigger ones as we've talked through from different areas there, prevents that stuff from happening in the first instance. If it does happen, though, there is actually a website that most police forces will pass you back across to called Action Fraud. It's a really good website. I'd suggest you kind of passed it round your staffing teams as a whole. So it doesn't just, we're just not talking about large sums of money. It's any kind of level of fraud that has been seen that you can report it through. And a lot of the fraud that they get is kind of cyber type of fraud. So the spam type emails that you potentially have fallen foul to, those types of thing, as well as money disappearing from businesses. So that there's also a lot of useful resources on there as well, which you can have a look at and read through, and it is worth having a look at, and certainly from kind of a, I think you can see on the screen there, it's got an I am, and you can select what you are. So if you have been a victim of fraud personally as well, you can go on and report that via the national police type stuff, rather than your local constabulary. Because certainly up here in Durham, if you have had anything like that happen, they just refer you across to the Action Fraud website for you to report anything. So does anybody have any questions? I haven't seen any come through on the chat, but if I just open it back up, no. So does anyone have any questions about any things that we talked about, or anything that that you want me to cover off in a bit more detail? Yep, hopefully that means I've got nothing come through, so hopefully that means that we've covered everything off in sufficient detail. So it was kind of a tag on the last presentation, given kind of we kind of drifted down this path of topic anyway. We do have a couple more lined up over the next couple of months. We're going to look at limited companies. So someone mentioned, I think in the last presentation, that it would be helpful to touch on limited companies. So we're going to have a coffee around that. Price mergers are still a big thing, so we're going to have some conversations around that as well. PCN finances, we're going to kind of do a bit on that. Beverly's mentioned good to have an update and new tips. So yeah, we can certainly potentially look at some stuff for later in the year for that. A bit more on personal expenses. I think it'd probably be worthwhile in the next couple of months looking at personal expenses and what that means, and the kinds of things that specifically partners can look at claiming on the back of their kind of tax returns. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then, and if you've missed any of the previous ones, obviously they are all recorded, and soon we'll be sending out an email to everyone following this presentation. And yes, the slides will be available on the back of that. Am I right there, Savinda?
Yeah, so for everybody that's signed up for the session, then we'll email some supporting information with that as well.
Yeah, happy days. And my email address and contact details are within that as well. So if you need to get in or would like to get in touch with me, feel free to do so off the back of that. But if there's a couple of people type of things, if you want to hang around, by all means feel free to do so. But thank you again for listening. I hope it's been useful, and we'll hopefully catch you next time around. Thank you.
That's all I felt.